Hello everyone, I am a storyteller. I know that you are watching this video to relax, maybe before bed. But before you close your eyes, please like the video and subscribe to the channel to support me. Now, relax, turn off the lights, and listen to this strange story. Mysterious apartment. I received the keys to my new apartment on a gloomy Monday afternoon, right after signing the lease in a small, stuffy real estate office. This apartment was suspiciously cheap, but its location was too perfect for me to bother thinking about. The homeowner said the place had been vacant for many years. As I stood in front of the old building, I looked up at the dusty windows, the paint peeling off like the skin of a decomposing creature. A strange feeling crept into my mind, an uneasy anticipation. As soon as I crossed the threshold, a sickly smell arose, the smell of time, of dust, of forgotten memories. I looked around. The living room was large but empty, the couch covered in dust, the rusty ceiling fan motionless. The kitchen is small and narrow with old wooden cabinets, and an old refrigerator that buzzes like a stuck insect. In the hallway, I suddenly stopped. On the wall hangs a beige rotary telephone, the twisted cord is worn out, the plastic casing has turned yellow over the years. I tried lifting the receiver. Line signal still works. That doesn't make sense at all. The first night, I couldn't sleep. The air in the room was thick and stuffy, as if something invisible was weighing me down. Then I heard it. Footstep. Very softly. Glide through the hallway. I turned on my phone's flashlight, my heart pounding. I got out of bed and looked down the dark hallway. But there was no one. One end leads to the front door, the other end leads to the living room. Everything is completely empty. Probably just imagination. I told myself so. But when I returned home the next evening, as soon as I opened the door, I heard it. The bell rang, cold, echoing throughout the empty apartment. I stood still, halfway taking off my coat. Who can call me? I have never given this phone number to anyone. Curiosity overcoming fear, I picked up the phone. Face. No answer. There was only a very faint rustling sound. Or is that the sound of breathing? I shivered and put down the receiver. The next day, right at noon, the phone rang again. This time, when I picked up the phone, I only heard a faint groan, like a soft hiss through my breath. I hung up so hard that I almost dropped the receiver. That evening, I decided to unplug the phone. But when I walked out of the room, it still rang. My heart seemed to stop beating. I turned around slowly. The stethoscope fell from its holder. Floating. There was no one there. A soft laugh rang out from the other end of the line. I rushed to the door, but it wouldn't open. The key was still in the lock, but it was as if an invisible force held it tightly. Clack. I'm back. The phone is still ringing. But now, all the electrical outlets in the house also started making buzzing sounds. The lights flashed and turned off continuously, darkness and light interwoven for each brief moment. Then the voice rang out. You can't escape. A cold hand was placed on my shoulder. I shouted. Suddenly, the door opened. I rushed out, staggered down the stairs, leaving everything behind. The next morning, I called the landlord, asking to cancel the contract immediately. I didn't go back to get my stuff. I just wanted to leave that place. But when I arrived at my new apartment and lay down on the bed, the feeling of relief had not yet arrived. The phone in my room rang. I picked up the phone, but no one answered. There was only one sound, heavy, shaky breathing. The next day, I called the landlord, Mr. Davidson. He just shrugged. Maybe there's a problem with the line. I'll call a technician to check. The technician arrived that afternoon. He checked the line and confirmed it was working properly. Nothing unusual. But I knew, something was very wrong. The calls don't stop. One night, I decided to do something different. When the phone rang, I picked it up but didn't say anything. I wait. On the other end of the line, was the sound of breathing. But this time, I heard something else, a very low mumbling sound, as if someone was trying to say my name. I felt a chill down my spine. "Who is there?" I whispered. No answer. There was just a click, then silence. Since then, I don't dare pick up the phone anymore. But I realized something horrifying. Even though the phone had been unplugged, every time I passed by the closet, I still felt it could ring at any time. And I have a feeling, if one day I hear what it says clearly, I will never be myself again. Have you ever received a strange call? If any, never pick up the phone. Knocking on the door midnight. There are things that happen at night that you can't explain. The noises, the cold winds creeping into each door crack, or simply the feeling that someone is watching you. I used to think it was just a product of my imagination, until I had to spend a terrifying night in an old restaurant, where there were constant haunting knocks on the door. And I know I'm not alone. The sound of knocking on the door rang out rhythmically and steadily. I was assigned to check out my brother's restaurant. It was an old place, closed for a long time, and he wanted to renovate it. That night, I went to make sure no one had broken in. Everything seemed normal, until I walked down to the basement. An old wooden door, the door knob was rusty. I tried turning it, but it was stuck. When I pulled harder, the rotten wood splintered in my hand. The sound of light footsteps on the wooden floor, the sound of the door creaking. Behind the door is a cramped room with old wooden shelves and dusty boxes. I shined a flashlight to check every corner, only seeing glass jars that had expired many years ago. Nothing scary. But then, I heard it. The sound of knocking on the door gradually fades and echoes. 3 knocks. A pause. Then again. I put my hand on the cold wall, and I felt vibrations. Not only did the sounds resonate in the air, but it was as if the building was carrying them everywhere. I felt my heartbeat quicken, my hands became sweaty. I checked the floor, looking for some secret door or tunnel, but there was only cracked concrete. I decided to say out loud, "Who's there?" There was a long silence, then the tapping continued, like an invisible drumbeat. I raised my phone to record, but my battery was draining faster than usual. I knew there was something there. Sound of hurried footsteps, rapid breathing. I left the basement, closing the door firmly behind me. As soon as the door closed, the knocking disappeared. I stood in the middle of the empty dining area, trying to calm myself. But then, another noise came from the floor, a strong, muffled thud, as if something had moved below. I decided to leave, but when I walked out of the restaurant, I realized I was no longer alone. Under the flickering street lights, an old gray car parked in the corner of the parking lot. 2 men stood next to the car, silently looking at me. They didn't move, didn't say anything. Just stood there, watching. The sound of a heart beating loudly, the sound of a car starting. I got in the car, locked the door, looked at them in the rearview mirror. They were still there. A feeling of anxiety came over me. I couldn't explain it, but I knew they had been there before. And perhaps they were still there, every night. A few days later, I came back. I couldn't leave this restaurant alone. I had to find the answer. This time, I came earlier, but when I entered, I could feel the atmosphere was different. Something had changed. The sound of electricity flashing, the sound of wind whistling softly through the door. I checked the basement door. It was still locked. But this time, when I opened it, I didn't hear anything. There was no knocking, no vibrations. I walked down slowly, each step creaking under my feet. And then, the lights went out. Sudden power cut, long silence. In complete darkness, I stood still, holding my breath. Then I heard it. Not a knock anymore, but a whisper. A small, incoherent voice, echoing through the narrow space. I couldn't understand it clearly, but I knew one thing for sure, I was no longer alone. I left the restaurant, this time for good. I couldn't go on. I tried to find out, but what I saw and heard was inexplicable. Knocks, mysterious men, and whispers in the dark. I tell this story not to scare anyone, but to warn you, if you hear a repetitive knock at night, think twice before opening the door. Because maybe, you don't want to know what's on the other side. Haunted boarding room. Have you ever lived in an old motel room and, in the middle of the night, suddenly heard strange footsteps in the hallway? You think it's just an illusion, but when you listen close, you realize, something is really moving out there. This is not a fictional story. This is a true story about a haunted motel room, where everyone who lived there carried a haunting that they could never forget. Room number 305. In 2019, Hung, a young man new to work, decided to rent a small room in an old boarding house on the outskirts of the city. The room price was surprisingly cheap, only half the price of other places, but Hung didn't think much. You need to save costs. Room number 305 is located at the end of the third-floor hallway, with a small window facing outside, where streetlight light glimmers through the old curtains. From the first day he moved in, Hung felt something was wrong. The air in the room is always colder than outside, even though it is hot in the middle of summer. But he reassured himself that perhaps he was being too sensitive. Things start to get weirder as night falls. Hung often hears footsteps in the hallway, even though there are very few people in this boarding house. At first, he thought it was the neighbor's voice. But every time I opened the door to check, the hallway was empty. There's no one. One night, while sleeping, Hung suddenly felt someone looking at him. A cold feeling spreads throughout the body. Opening his eyes, he saw a black shadow floating on the ceiling. It wasn't a dream. The shadow took the form of a woman with long hair, a pale face, and empty black eyes. Hung wanted to scream, but his throat felt choked. Then a soft voice rang right in my ear. "Don't leave." Hung jumped up, sweat pouring out like a shower. But when I looked around the room, everything was still quiet. The door was still closed, there was no one there but him. The next morning, Hung met the innkeeper to ask about this room. At first, he just smiled awkwardly, saying, "You must be working too hard, so you're hallucinating." But when he saw Hung's bewildered expression, the innkeeper sighed and told a story. 3 years ago, there was a young girl who rented room 305. She lived alone and rarely communicated with anyone. One day, people found her hanging right next to the window. The scary thing is that, after her death, many people who rented this room encountered strange phenomena. Someone saw her silhouette in the mirror. Some people hear whispers right in their ears every night. After hearing the story, Hung felt cold. He decided to leave here as soon as possible. That evening, Hung packed his things. As he stood in front of the old mirror to check one last time, he suddenly felt a cold breath on the back of his neck. Feeling something was wrong, he slowly raised his head to look in the mirror. And then, behind him, a figure stood there. Girl with long hair, pale face, empty eyes. She didn't move, just stood there, staring at him. Hung panicked and quickly rushed out of the room without daring to look back. As the door closed behind him, once again, the soft voice rang out. "Don't leave." After leaving the boarding house, Hung never returned there. But every time he recalls this story, he still shivers because he remembers that cold feeling and lifeless eyes. Room 305 was then still rented. But no one stayed long. And the story about that mysterious girl is still an unsolved mystery. Do you believe in ghosts? Or do you think it's all just the imagination of weak-minded people? But if one day, you hear a whisper right in your own room, what will you do? If you like horror stories like this, don't forget to like, share and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next scary stories. And remember, if there is a suspiciously cheap motel room, think carefully before moving in.